everyday thing. It's an everyday thing. It's an everyday thing when you let your nuts hang.
I was born an identical twin. My mother was 17 and my father was 19. He was already deep into his battle with alcoholism. When he was 16 years old, he was in a head-on collision with an armored truck. And from what I've been told, he was really never the same after that. And that's when his drinking really began. And he has never stopped drinking. So once I was born, my mother initially tried to do it solo, taking care of my sister and I. Obviously, she was really young, broke. She was on welfare. Pretty quickly, she ended up meeting the guy that would be the father of my other 5 siblings. And he was an alcoholic as well. And from what I've gathered, their relationship was really, really rocky. So my maternal grandparents took my sister and I when we were 18 months old, and they cared for us at that point. I grew up in a really rural part of northern Pennsylvania where there's a lot of impoverished people, and we grew up really poor. My grandparents really did the best they could with what they had, but neither one of them had more than a 6th grade education, and they themselves became parents really young. My grandmother was 15 and my grandfather was 20 when they got married, and she was already pregnant with her first of 4 kids. I was SA'd by an uncle and a cousin. It started when I was 5 and continued until I was 13. Now, my grandmother, who was really everything to me, she was my caregiver, my protector, the only person who ever loved me unconditionally. She died of colon cancer the summer I turned 12. She was diagnosed when I was 6, and she battled it for as long as she could. But after that, my grandfather was an over-the-road truck driver, so my sister and I largely raised ourselves and each other. He would be gone during the week, and he would come home on the weekends to take us to the grocery store and so that we could wash his clothes. We really quickly learned to cook and clean and get ourselves up in the morning, get ourselves off to school, on the bus, off the bus, do our homework, all that. Hamburger helper was a godsend in those days, and at 13 I thought I was a 5-star chef making some taco hamburger helper. My grandfather had spent his life with my grandmother. I mean, I told you they got together when they were really young. So he was incredibly heartbroken and really lost. He had no idea how to raise children, let alone 2 little girls. So he really had no idea what he was doing, and he definitely did the best that he could. He ended up remarrying when we were 15, and we moved to where she lived, switched schools in 10th grade. By our senior year, we had enough credits to graduate, so we ended up both going to college. At that point, I was in my first relationship with my boyfriend, who would become my husband and the father of my oldest daughter. When I finished my spring semester at college, I ended up moving in with my boyfriend and his family. I got pregnant on my 18th birthday, and when we found out that I was pregnant, we ended up getting married. I worked 3 jobs to save money, and he finished high school. After our daughter was born, we ended up moving so that he could go to college, and I stayed home with the baby and took care of the house for almost the first year, and then I ended up getting my CNA so that I could do in-home care. I had done unlicensed in-home care previously, and nursing was what I was enrolled in college. Watching the hospice nurses take care of my grandmother when she was dying really inspired me, and I do love to take care of people, so nursing was a great fit for me. So I worked as a CNA for a while, and then I ended up getting a patient care tech job at the local hospital. I worked nights, so I went in at 7 p.m. and got off at 7 a.m. When I got off work in the mornings, I would come home and take care of my daughter, get her breakfast, get my husband breakfast, do some housework, and then I would lay down about 11 a.m. and sleep until 4, and then I'd get up and, make dinner and everything and get my husband set up for the night with the baby, and then I would go to work. But one day I woke up, it was probably about 1 in the afternoon, someone was pounding on my door. And so I flew downstairs thinking that somebody was going to be having a heart attack on my front porch or something. And I opened the door, and my neighbor from across the street is holding my daughter, and she has nothing on but a diaper and a pair of socks that she's clearly put on herself. And he said, she was playing in the street and I didn't see anybody around, so I just picked her up. Of course, he was like, that's super dangerous. And of course, I apologized and thanked him profusely. I was absolutely mortified and terrified for my child. So I went to go talk to my husband and figure out what in the world. So I went up to the attic, and he was playing a video game, which was fairly typical. But his only response was, I guess I'll have to start locking the door. So at that point, I hired a babysitter, and she's who watched my child when I was sleeping. My marriage was a young one, and it had a lot of issues, some pretty big issues. A lot of them that I wrote off or tried to make excuses for, like, he's just short-tempered, that kind of thing. However, the biggest one was just how unhappy my husband was, and I just didn't know what to do. And I didn't know what was wrong until I figured out one day that he was seeing someone else, and that someone else was a man. Hey everyone. In this video, I'm going to be doing a timeline about the events, everything that happened with Bill and I. I've gotten a lot of comments where people just seem to be confused about the timeline, so I'm just going to do a simplified version of that. So hopefully that'll help clear up any confusion, because I know there's multiple videos, 2 people telling the story, and so it can get kind of discombobulated sometimes. So here's the simplified version of the timeline of mine and Bill's whole relationship. We met 12 years ago, and we dated for 6 weeks, and he dumped me. At the time, he was married to his first wife. I did not have any idea. I reached out to him a couple months after he had dumped me because I found out I was pregnant and there was a chance he was the father. I had also had a one-night stand with somebody else, so there was a chance that he wasn't the father. We did a DNA test before the baby was born, where they drew my blood and stuff. We found out he wasn't the father, and that was that. 3 years later, he had separated from his wife, and we were in a relationship. Yes, he did sleep with my sister during that time. We got back together after that, and I was in prison when he met Marissa. Marissa found out about me. I'm not exactly sure how long they had been dating when she found out about me, but she gave him an ultimatum, and he dumped me, and they carried on with their relationship. So 6 years goes by before he contacts me again. This was last September we started talking. We weren't intimate until January, and in March is when I met Marissa in the driveway. Yes, I was late and had a positive home pregnancy test. However, I started to bleed less than 2 weeks after that happened, but I am pregnant now, and I'm due in January. On the day that I met Marissa in the driveway, she did leave and went to North Carolina and stayed with her family. I did move in soon after she left, and I've been living with Bill since. In April, he started to reconcile with his wife, and I had no idea about their reconciliation until August 3rd. One question I've gotten quite frequently is, why did I tell Marissa? Why didn't Bill do it? And he actually answered this in a video of his, but I'll just reiterate it. I guess he had tried to break things off with her and it didn't work. So he asked me to tell her because he knew that if it was coming from me, she would actually hear it. Do I think it was my place to tell her? Absolutely not. However, the flip side of that coin is she just goes longer without knowing that her husband's seeing somebody else or has been seeing somebody else. Do I wish I had done things differently? Absolutely. There are a lot of things that I would do differently if I had the information then that I have now. However, time only runs one way. I absolutely do not defend what I did and the choices that I made. It was wrong, plain and simple. I hurt her and I participated in things that hurt her, and for that I am sorry. Also, it's very complicated in that, and I know I don't speak for everyone here, but love made me do things that I wouldn't have imagined myself doing. That kind of leads me into the other comment I get quite frequently, which is that I can't possibly be sorry for what I've done because if I was sorry, I wouldn't have done it in the first place. And to me, that's just really flawed logic. Humans just don't work that way. I believe that both can be true, that you can do things that you're not proud of and you can be sorry for those things that you do. I know that I've done things that I knew I would probably be sorry about later. Anybody who's drank too much or stayed up too late or slept with that annoying guy at the bar, kind of knows what I'm talking about. In all seriousness, I am sorry that I hurt her, truly. I think that if we as people considered the consequences of our actions regarding others more often, we wouldn't do some of the things that we do. For example, in the comment section where people are telling me to go, off myself and that, they hope that, my baby isn't healthy and it's the spawn of the devil and stuff like that. I mean, do I think that these people are awful people? No. Do I think that if something happened to someone because of a bunch of hateful comments, that they would be sorry about it? Maybe. Or that if, a baby wasn't born healthy, that they would be sorry about that? Probably. If your answer is, I don't know you, so you don't matter, or I think you're a bad person, so anything I say is justified, or something along those lines, what is that if not trying to justify bad behavior? As far as my new video series that's coming out, it's not some ploy for sympathy. It's just me telling my story, plain and simple. So many people have said, stop talking about that, whole situation. And obviously it's not something that should or could be talked about forever. So then I start giving some of my history that leads up to my story of addiction and recovery and my involvement with the justice system. And I get comments like, why are you trying to make us feel bad for you or justify your behavior. It just confuses me. So anyway, just some food for thought. At the end of my last video, I had just found out that my husband of 3 years had been experimenting with another man. So in response to this, of course, we talked about it a lot. And what was more important to me, bottom line, than him exploring his sexuality or anything like that, was just how unhappy he was and how trapped he felt in our marriage. We were so young, and he had a much more typical upbringing that just didn't prepare him for the roles of father and husband at such a young age. So at this point, I decided to leave, to separate. I went and rented an apartment, enrolled in myself in nursing school, and started to make the arrangements. He seemed relatively unfazed until the day I started packing, and then things got really ugly really quick. Actually, it started over whether or not I was taking pots and pans with me when I left, believe it or not. He got extremely violent and more physical than he'd ever been before, and the cops ended up getting called. We lived in the downtown area of a city, and I mean, the houses are so close together that you could open your window and reach out and touch your neighbor's house. So inevitably, the cops ended up getting called, and because I had marks and bruises, they were going to arrest him either way. And if I didn't sign the paperwork to have him charged, they were going to call CPS to have my child removed from the situation. The whole thing was incredibly awful, the whole situation. It was just terrible. I mean, not only was my relationship ending and my whole life changing, but this person that I loved, the father of my child, was getting arrested, and he went to jail. The next day, I got a U-Haul, and I moved me and my 2.5-year-old to a tiny third-story walk-up across town. I mean, the oven was so small you couldn't even fit a full-size cookie sheet in it. So thankfully, I was able to keep the amazing babysitter I had for the daytime when I was in nursing school, but I didn't have anyone to watch my daughter at night. So I ended up having to work 2 16-hour shifts on Saturday and Sunday overnight, and my daughter's grandmother would take her on the weekends, and that's when she would spend time with her father as well. So school was a licensed practical nursing diploma program. It was a year-long program, and it was pretty intense to the point where you couldn't miss classroom time or clinical time. After a few months of adjusting to a new schedule, new life, I started to date a nurse that I worked with at the hospital. He was quite a bit older than me. I was 21 and he was 36, but he was really sweet and funny and handsome, and he was really supportive of me. I remember one day my daughter was sick. She was running a fever, and I couldn't take her to the babysitter, but I had to go to school. So he took the day off work and stayed home with her. And by the time I got home from school, I opened the door and she was laying on the couch, and he had a fan running on her. She had had a fever and it had broken, so she was hot. And he was folding my laundry and had done my dishes. And I just remember thinking that that was the most romantic thing anybody had ever done for me. And he was just a really, really sweet guy. So we ended up moving in together. A few months later, I got pregnant. And at this point, I was really happy. We were really happy. My life was incredibly busy, but it was super full. I finished nursing school, graduated, and my pregnancy was going really well until it wasn't. One day I just started to bleed. I was 20 weeks pregnant. I called the doctor. The doctor told me to lay down on the couch, and if the bleeding hadn't stopped in an hour, to just go to the emergency room and get checked out. So while I was laying on the couch and thinking I had nothing to worry about, it turns out that my placenta had detached from my uterine wall, and my son basically suffocated during that time. So once I got to the hospital, I started to go into labor at that point, and so I was pretty hysterical. So they put me out, just took me to the operating room, and unfortunately, because of the time that I was in the operating room and then the amount of time it took me in recovery, I wasn't able to hold my son before they had to take him away. So the whole thing was just really traumatic for me. Of course, I was completely wrecked emotionally, so was my boyfriend, but this was the hospital that I worked at. I knew a lot of the doctors, so when I left the hospital, I ended up leaving with a prescription for 90 Lortab with 3 refills. That's when I got hooked on opiates. Like most people, I hid my addiction really, really well at first. I managed it pretty well. So, of course, I convinced myself and everyone else that I was in pain and I needed the medication. And, of course, I didn't have a problem. I could quit whenever I wanted to. Yada, yada, yada. So, of course, I was pretty deeply depressed for quite a while after losing my son. I made some pretty rash decisions. I broke up with my boyfriend. It hurt a lot to be around him, and I was afraid. I was afraid that he would leave me too. I was afraid I didn't deserve him. The one thing I did do during all this was I passed my boards, my state licensing, no problem. I ended up taking a job that was closer to back where I was from, and I rented a place back there. My lease was up on my apartment anyway. So at this point, I'm starting to realize that maybe I do actually have a problem, and I did what a lot of addicts do, which is try the geographical cure first. I had just taken a job near my hometown, gotten a place to live, and my opiate addiction was in its infancy, and I was trying the geographical cure. At that point, my estranged husband had gone through some pretty big life changes of his own, and we had decided to try to work things out for our daughter's sake. So he, my almost 4-year-old, and I moved back to my hometown. I was working long shifts at the nursing home, and he is what they call a weekend warrior. He was in the National Guard. This was 2009, so they were still deploying a lot of troops to the Middle East. However, aside from that, he didn't work. He took care of our daughter. Very quickly, our relationship became much worse than it had ever been. He had been dealing with a lot of mental health stuff throughout our entire relationship, but it had only gotten increasingly worse, and he was just really unhappy and really lost, and I just really had no idea how to help him. I was working on the palliative care and rehab unit at the nursing home. Like I said, I was working long shifts, and that coupled with my relationship problems was just really emotionally draining and physically draining as well. So it didn't take long, and I was back on pills. I've struggled with anxiety and depression for as long as I remember, and when I was taking opiates, it was like I was invincible. It was the best I've ever felt. I've been on a variety of mental health medications throughout my life: antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications to help me sleep better, to help me feel better, and opiates kind of blew all of that out of the water for me. I no longer felt overwhelmed. I no longer felt anxious. I didn't want to hide from the world. I didn't procrastinate. I didn't get tired. I felt like I was Superwoman and I could do anything. I didn't break down. I didn't oversleep. And I felt like if anybody knew how right it felt, how good it felt when I was taking this medication, these pills. They would never ask me to stop. Even more than that, if they could understand how bad it felt not to have them, they would never take them away. Now, at this point, I knew I had a problem because I had gone through short periods of withdrawal and it felt horrible. And I knew at this point I didn't want to be beholden to these pills. I didn't want to, as good as it felt to have them, I didn't want to feel what it felt like to not have them. But I just didn't know how to quit. I had so much at stake. I was responsible for so much and I had so much to lose. I was terrified to ask for help. So my nurse manager, she had no idea what was going on, but she knew I had some family issues going on. So she told me to take 2 weeks vacation, get my head on straight, and come back. So I took my 2 weeks and I took my daughter and I went south to my twin sisters. She's the only one at this point who knew kind of what was going on. So at this point I went through withdrawals completely, and it was, to my memory, the worst thing I've ever experienced. Now, I know it can't actually be the worst thing I've ever experienced because since then I've had a gram a day of H habit and I've kicked it in a jail cell. So I know that that wasn't the worst thing I've ever experienced, but I think what made it so bad was I just had no idea what was coming. I remember my legs ached so badly it felt like my bones were bruised. I sneezed so much that I gagged and puked. I couldn't sleep. I sweat through every set of sheets my sister had. I couldn't eat. I was so anxious that I felt like I could crawl out of my skin and it still wouldn't feel good. A week and 4 days went by and I had to go home, whether I was ready or not. And at that point, I was through the worst of it, but I felt raw still. I could barely sleep. I wasn't eating. I was hydrating. That was it. I was emotionally a disaster, but I had to go home because I had a job and a life and I couldn't run away from it. Now, I think at this point, if I had actually gone to rehab and gotten some help, like maybe 30 days inpatient or something like that, I would have stood a chance of kicking the habit for good and never going back and never having to go through everything I went through. But I didn't because, of course, I was like everybody else and I thought it wasn't that bad and that as long as I wanted it bad enough, I could do it on my own. But I went home and everything was still the same. Everything was still there. So in 6 days' time, I was right back on pills. And at this point, I knew I had a monkey on my back and I didn't know how to get rid of it. But what I did know was that I never wanted to go through withdrawals like that again. And I would do just about anything to keep that from happening. In my last video, I had left off, my opiate addiction had evolved some. I had experienced complete withdrawals for the first time, gone to my sister's to get clean. I came home and everything was pretty much the same, and I was back to using opiates within the week. Also, before I get to this next part, I just want to point out that I'm not going to go into graphic detail about the abuse of my ex-husband. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us. He passed away about a year ago, and he is the father of my daughter, and no matter what, she loves her dad. Thankfully, she was very young when all of this happened, so I'm not going to speak ill of the dead, and I'm just not going to go into detail. But suffice it to say that our relationship was worse than it had ever been, physically more aggressive than it had ever been, and everything kind of culminated one day and reached a boiling point where the police got involved again to a further extent this time. That led to a permanent order of protection, the removal of pew-pew from his possession and some court-ordered therapy and classes, that kind of thing. I decided to move to Virginia. At that point, my sister was going through a divorce herself. She had 3 children, all under the age of 5. So together we had 4 kids, all under the age of 5. At this point, I was 22. And let's see. So I moved down there and I got a job. I really needed to be with my sister, and I felt she really needed me. My sister and my relationship is a complicated one. I've gone through a lot of life's greatest experiences with her and a lot of life's worst experiences with her. The death of my grandmother when we were 12, well, almost 12, being SA'd right alongside her. So we've definitely gone through the worst of things. And ironically, we seem to go through, in adulthood, we seem to kind of go through the same things at the same times, or at least we did when we were a lot younger. We got married a day apart. We had our oldest daughters 2 months apart, and my younger daughter and her son are 2 weeks apart. We got divorced a couple months apart. I mean, ironically, everything sort of happened where we did a lot of our life experiences at the same time, even when it wasn't planned, like pregnancies and stuff like that. So it would stand to reason that we would just come together when life got really hard for the both of us. Unfortunately, I moved, and within a few months, I wasn't able to outrun my addiction, and within a few months we were both using pills. This was 2010, so at that point you could, if you knew what you were doing, you could call in fake prescriptions. So for Loratab, you didn't need like a paper script or an electronic one, or even to show ID when you picked up at that point. So anyway, so I would call the pharmacies and pretend to be the doctor, and in order to get the doctor's DEA number, I would call the doctor's office pretending to be the pharmacist. So that's how I'd get DEA numbers, and I would call in fake scripts under fake names with fake addresses. So it was harder for them to trace where it was coming from. However, there was still a paper trail, and a year later I ended up getting caught. And also, just for public knowledge, you can't do that anymore. Everything's managed electronically now. Opiates are really, well managed now, since, the whole epidemic kind of exploded onto the scene the last 10 years or so. Like I said, I knew that there was a paper trail that was following me and I would get caught eventually, but I was so deep in my addiction and just trying to outrun physical sickness that as long as that day wasn't today, I didn't really care. But of course, today came eventually, and some detectives came to my house and I got arrested. And I got charged with 99 counts of prescription fraud. I was booked into jail. I was denied bond initially because it's a bunch of felonies. And so the magistrate denied me bond. And that was the first time that I'd ever experienced jail. So I knew I was stuck for at least a few days, and I knew I was going to be sick. And at this point, unfortunately, the jails didn't have a protocol for opiate withdrawal, because the truth is that opiate withdrawal, there are some withdrawals like alcohol and benzos that can really hurt you. Opiate withdrawal will just make you wish that you weren't here anymore. It's really painful, but it can't, not that it can't, but typically it doesn't cause severe distress. One thing that I'll never forget about the first time I went to jail is the process of getting dressed out. So they strip you down naked, examine your body looking for any hidden things. You take off everything that you own, bras, panties, all of that, and you put on this scratchy, heavy, stinky jumpsuit, and it's just touching your naked body. And at that point, you become less than human. Truly, what haunts me most is jail, because it doesn't matter how much time passes. Once you walk through those heavy locked doors, it haunts my dreams. It's what I dread. It's what I will always dread. And I don't think I'll ever stop fearing going back, no matter how long I'm out. From there, once I was incarcerated for the prescription fraud and I had 99 counts, I kind of knew the jig was up and there was no way I was going to get prescriptions anymore. So at that point, there was no way to get anything else illicitly, because I didn't have any connections on the street or anything like that. So I was in jail for 5 days and I made bond. I got out, and 2 days later I had another court date from a charge I had gotten much earlier in the year regarding a theft charge. I had stolen some groceries, and at the time the threshold was anything greater than $200, so it was a felony. So that threshold was really easy to meet. My guidelines called for probation, no incarceration. However, once the judge found out that I had got so many new felony charges while I was awaiting sentencing on his 2 charges, he decided to sentence me to 2 years, suspended 1 year and 10 months, and sent me to jail for 2 months that day. I went to jail that day in my high heels and my dress. I didn't have any time to get my affairs in order or anything like that. So I remember being shackled and the shackles rubbing my ankles raw, and they were bleeding by the time I made the long walk from the courthouse to the jail. I remember sitting in the holding cell waiting to get dressed out to go up to the jail and just freezing, and they make you wait hours and hours. So it was pretty awful. But I think what haunts me the most is the look on my sister's face when the judge called all rise. She couldn't even stand. And I just knew that my life would never be the same after all of that. I was going to miss my daughter's first day of school, her first day of kindergarten, and I was going to turn 23 in jail, and I knew I was going to lose everything, and I did. I lost my apartment, all of the things in it. The only thing I didn't lose was my car. So, and thankfully my daughter was safe. She was with her grandmother. I had already taken her north before my court date. So thankfully she was safe, but nothing was ever the same after that. And I was so angry, and I felt so misunderstood by the judge, and I felt like life wasn't fair, and I wasn't treated fairly, and I was just really angry and really bitter, and I also wasn't ready to quit using. So in jail, I told you before I went to jail I had no street connections, and in jail I met a bunch of heroin addicts who saw somebody who was green to the game and had some assets like my car and a little bit of money, that sort of thing. So I didn't even make it out of the jail parking garage when I got out without a needle in my arm. So at that point, I was addicted to dope. And the next 3.5 years I spent in and out of hotel rooms, homelessness, making money any way I could, including SW. It was pretty miserable. I felt so hopeless and trapped. My life was a constant cycle of fear of being sick and anything I could do to try to avoid being sick. It was awful, and I felt like there was no way out. Obviously, at this point, I was on probation, and I violated a couple of times, got some new charges, ended up serving another 10 months about in jail, and then once I got out, after the 10 months, I relapsed initially, but at that point, I was just sick and tired of being sick and tired. I had been hospitalized for trying to end everything, and that was a significantly long hospitalization, and I ended up going to treatment, and at the end of all of that, I did relapse again, but then I ended up getting on the methadone clinic. Getting on the methadone clinic wasn't a linear journey, to be sure. I used for a while, even after I started taking methadone. I don't recommend that because all it does is drive your tolerance up. But after a while, I managed to stop being a knucklehead, and there was some light at the end of the tunnel. I ended up getting an apartment, a car, a job, all of that. I kind of got my life back at that point. And my daughter was coming to see me regularly, spending time, and I was on the road to getting her back. And then I found out I was pregnant with my younger daughter. I immediately wanted off of the clinic, off of the medication. I feared what it would do to my child. However, the doctor at the clinic told me that he wouldn't detox me or taper me because it was harmful to my unborn child, and he reassured me that women had babies on methadone. So I continued on the clinic my entire pregnancy. I ended up in a high-risk OBGYN's office. I delivered her 3 weeks early, and I delivered her at just before 8 a.m., before I'd taken my dose for that day, and she was fine. She was perfect when she was born, but by about 5 o'clock, I noticed she was shaking when I unswaddled her, and she had some diarrhea, some definite signs of illness. So I told the nurse, hey, get in touch with the NICU, have them come check her out. Well, they didn't get to her until 9 o'clock that night, and by the time they got to her, she was so sick that they had to put an IV in and give her anti-seizure meds and fluids, stuff like that. So that was a horrific experience, and I wouldn't recommend it for anyone. I felt like a horrible person, a horrible mother. She spent 6 weeks in the NICU, and I was with her every day. And then, of course, after she detoxed and everything, she came home, and life was what it was with the baby. It was pretty normal. I was still on probation at the time for all of my previous crimes, and that November I ended up stealing a coat from a department store, and I got caught. And I knew that once I got convicted, because I would be, that it would violate my probation for all my other charges, and I had a little bit over 15 years hanging over my head. So I made a very unwise decision to run from probation and the courts. Unfortunately, that didn't last very long. I got woken up really early in the morning on my younger daughter's first birthday, actually, and it was the detectives with a bunch of cops, and they came to get me and took me to jail. And I knew I wasn't going to get a bond, and I knew that I was going to be down for a while. I had gotten pulled out of bed by detectives early in the morning on my younger daughter's first birthday. So I knew I was going to go to jail. I had violated probation, run from probation, and court. I had a new larceny charge at this point, and that was going to violate me. I was going to be found convicted. That was going to violate me on all of my previous convictions that I was on probation for, and at that point I had about 15 years hanging over my head. So I knew I was in to do a chunk of time. I didn't know exactly how much, and I remember I met with one of my lawyers pretty early on in my stay, and she told me that I'd be lucky if I walked out in less than 10 years. So that was definitely a pill to swallow. However, I had a much more immediate concern, and that was that I was cold turkey detoxing from a high dose of methadone. I just cold turkeyed off of methadone, and it was probably about a week before I actually felt the worst of the acute withdrawals, 30 days before I was through the acute withdrawals, and 6 months before I was through the worst of the post-acute withdrawals. Now, post-acute can last up to a year. Methadone is an incredibly long-acting drug, and it's that way to provide comfort, but also to try to make it much harder to get any sort of high that you would try to achieve. So it's an incredibly long-acting medication, and it takes a really long time to work itself out of your body, especially if you have a slow metabolism like me. Once I got through the worst of the withdrawals, jail was not great, but it was bearable. One thing that I've learned in life is that humans can adjust to just about any condition, and once you've adjusted your new normal, it's kind of hard to remember what life used to feel like. The worst part was I would experience like life, freedom, that kind of thing in my dreams, and waking up and kind of being hit with the concrete wall and remembering that I wasn't free was probably the most jarring and hard emotionally. It's crazy to me how easy it is to forget what a hug feels like, or a pillow, or the breeze on your face. And, these were things that I had been in jail before, but I always kind of knew was a short-term thing. And it took an entire year for me to even go through the process of being fully sentenced. Even once I was fully sentenced, it was still really confusing just because I had so many cases, so many jurisdictions, and the whole thing can be really confusing. And so you have to kind of wait for the state to add up your time and give you a release date. I didn't get any sort of an actual release date from the state until almost 3 years into my sentence. So I knew I was going to be in for a while, at least 3 years, and that was if I went to prison right away and right into the program that I was court ordered to do. And that didn't happen. At this point, I was experiencing severe depression and exhibiting some signs of instability. Wasn't getting any treatment for it, and I'm not going to really go into details, but I did try to end everything, ended up in the hospital, and then later in a state-run facility for 3 months. I immediately went there from there to prison. However, because there isn't a lot of facilities for women in this state, there's only one facility that has the medical care I needed at that point, and that was the maximum security prison. So, and that didn't have the program I was court ordered to do, and it wasn't a prison that I would have gotten sent to for any other reason. The majority of the population are violent offenders with really long-term sentences. A lot of them have life. It's a really restrictive setting. But I was stuck there until the doctors and the mental health team decided that I was well enough to go to the minimum security prison. Going from jail to prison was good in a lot of ways. I mean, it was the first time I'd been outside in over a year, and so that was nice. There was more to occupy my time. A few more creature comforts were kind of offered. It's just set up for a longer term setting. Obviously, it was not great in a lot of ways, pretty traumatizing. I remember my first day in general population. I was actually walking into my unit, and I was watching a girl being carried out on a stretcher, just covered in blood. And I don't know what happened or what she did or whatever, but somebody decided to, teach her a lesson. So, of course, I was like, oh, boy, is this what happens every day? Is this what I'm in for? So it was kind of scary, but I adjusted like everything else. And like everybody else. After 18 months, I ended up getting transferred to the minimum security prison, and I went into a behavior modification program, which is in this state what they have for drug treatment. A lot of people think that the program is garbage and it doesn't do anything for you, and I won't say that I went into it with a great attitude, because I didn't initially. However, I did take advantage of the counselors that were available and a lot of the treatment work that was available, and I do feel like I gained a lot from it. Also, drugs are pretty rampant in prison, and especially in the maximum security prison. And at one point I had gotten a habit on the inside, and that was just the definition of insanity to me. And one day I just was so tired of it all, and I just came to this realization that the roller coaster had to the ride had to end sometime. Why not get off the roller coaster now? And that was about a month before I got transferred. So I never did drugs again after that, thankfully. And I really did take advantage of the program that I was offered. I have a whole lot to say about my experience in prison, and I will in other videos, but one thing I do want to say before I go is just that a part of me will always be with those women. There's no way that you can experience so much with other people and see the world as all good or all bad, or see people as all good or all bad, because the truth is that it's just not like that. People are a good combination of both, and I've learned that. I made a couple of friends, and a lot of people I will never forget. So I had just been transferred to the minimum security prison to complete the program. I had been court ordered to the behavior modification program. While I was in this program, I also was a GED tutor, and I did night college classes, so I kept really busy while I was in this program, and it was really, really good for me. It taught me a lot, and I learned a lot about myself, and I worked through a lot of my past trauma, and I just got really comfortable with who I was and kind of made amends with some of the choices that I had made and where they had led me. I was almost all the way through the program, less than 6 months to complete, when COVID hit. So we knew about it in the prison, I remember back in January, and it really started to kind of go through the prison population in March. And I got the virus in the first week in April. At this point, the entire prison was on complete lockdown, and we weren't allowed basically out of our cells except to use the bathroom and to shower every third day. Once I tested positive for the virus, I was put in a one-man segregation cell, which at that time housed 3 different people. Unfortunately, they just didn't have the staff and the medical PPE, stuff like that, to really attend to us. So I remember I didn't even get Tylenol for the first 24 hours. And I was lucky I didn't have any comorbidities or anything. So luckily I recovered within a couple of weeks. And there were a lot of women who weren't so lucky. They either had severe long-term effects, or, they just never made it to see the outside again, which was really, really sad. The truth is that prisons just are not designed to control the spread of any sort of disease. I mean, we were housed in 2-man cells, and even though we were confined to our cells, I mean, we still were using the bathroom en masse and, showering. And I mean, you just do everything as a community in that setting. So it's just not designed to restrict the spread of disease at all. And it definitely didn't with COVID. I mean, to be honest, the prison wasn't even set up to figure out how to feed everybody without the help of the inmate population. So that was a really wild time. And so at this point, we were confined to our cells for, who knew how long. And thank God I'm a reader, and books are really what got me through. But I was due to be released in August 4th. So, I was pretty close to the end of my sentence anyway. And so I was just glad I was getting out of there. About the first week in July, they started to kind of do some paperwork so that people could get released early if they were nonviolent and stuff like that. I filled out, the mountains of paperwork and all the red tape, and it ended up getting me released 10 days early. So I left prison July 23rd, 2020, and obviously I was happy to leave prison. My oldest daughter was there to greet me, and we drove straight back to my hometown where her grandparents and her dad lived. So at that point, obviously I'd switched my probation to a different state, and I just started to live my life, rebuild it. I got a job. I moved into a sober living house. Pretty quickly, within 6 months, I was in a relationship that got serious. After a year, we moved in together, and I just, lived life. I worked, and everything was good for 3.5 years, and then I ended up violating probation for using CBD and kratom, and then I got extradited here to Virginia. I served 6 months, and they let me off probation. So at this point, since January, I'm completely out of the criminal justice system involvement, no probation, nothing like that. So that's really good. Of course, I do have good behavior that I have to maintain for a period of 5 years. But other than that, I'm happy to be free finally. I mean, I've been trying to do probation since 2012. So, getting off of it, even though I did 6 more months in in jail, getting off of probation was a relief, to say the least. Obviously, this is the point when Bill and I kind of linked up, and you guys kind of know the story after that. I will say this, life is not a fairy tale. It's just not. My story isn't this great redemptive tale where I kind of fuck everything up and then fix everything and life's perfect and I ride off into the sunset. I mean, life doesn't work that way, and neither do people, unfortunately. I will say that I'm proud of the progress that I've made, and I do know that I have a lot of work left to do. As Robert Frost so eloquently said, and I have miles to go before I sleep. So, I mean, I have lots to do before I die, and a lot of that, is working on myself and improving who I am as a person, and being a good mom and being just a good human, to be honest. So I'm a work in progress, and I've never said any differently, but I am proud of the progress that I've made and that I'm clean today. Will spend the rest of my life working to do better, be better, and I really hope that, that's kind of what everybody does.
Day and night. For some women, it can start working in as fast as 1 week.